The sun had baked the dirt into stone and the air into fire. She was only a girl thin like shadow hands shaking as she clutched a cracked jug. She wasn't supposed to have it, but she needed water. Her baby brother hadn't cried in hours, and her mother lay still too long, so she ran to the purification tank and dipped her jug. But they saw her. The Kia enforcers dragged her to the center square, where punishments were public and brutal, and the sentence was always the same for stealing government. Water in Sector 9, amputation of the dominant limb, no appeal, no mercy. But just as the blade lifted and the chains tightened, a voice rang out, not from her people, not from her world. A human stepped forward and said 5 words that silenced the crowd and changed everything. He said, "Take me instead of her." She had no name that anyone remembered, not since the ration riots took her family and the dust storm swallowed her home, and the overseers cleared Sector 9 of anyone too weak to work. But she had survived by crawling under floors, sleeping in trash tubes, and listening at night to the groans of the dying until her ears grew numb and her heart small. And today she had done the one thing you must never do. She stole water from the government tank, not much, just a handful, into a cracked bottle to bring to her little brother, who was barely breathing, and her body shook from thirst and fear. But her will was still stronger than the ropes they tied her with. So when the enforcers caught her, they dragged her to the punishment square, a wide-open plaza ringed with electric pikes and silent watchers, the ones who didn't dare help her, but didn't look away either, because everyone in Sector 9 knew the law. Water theft meant one thing: you lose your arm, the one you use to work, because without it, you become a burden, and burdens die quickly in a place like this. And she knelt now with her face in the dirt and the steel clamp around her wrist, and the enforcer with the bright red sash standing beside the execution blade, not saying anything, just waiting for the timer to beep, because executions were timed and broadcasted to remind everyone what rules cost. But then something impossible happened. Something no one had seen in years. A figure stepped through the crowd, tall, strange, and silent, wearing a dusty jacket, not local, not from the mines or the farms, and certainly not from the authority. He was human, one of the outer system traders who only passed through with caravans or dropships and never got involved. But this one walked straight into the square, like he owned it, and raised a hand and said, "Take me instead of her." The enforcers blinked confused, then laughed, because humans didn't bleed for aliens, not in this galaxy, not in the drought sectors, where water was worth limbs and hope was a myth. But the man kept walking until he stood between the girl and the blade, and the crowd stopped breathing as the enforcer stepped forward and said, "What game are you playing, Offworlder?" And the human said, "No game, just justice. She's a child, and I have 2 arms, let mine pay for hers." Enforcer frowned, then waved to the magistrate, watching from the shaded deck, and after a pause the magistrate nodded, because humans were technically neutral, and if one volunteered for a punishment, the system allowed it, as long as it didn't interfere with production, and this girl wasn't producing anything, so the switch was legal. And the crowd parted as the girl was yanked back, and the human took her place, kneeling calmly as the clamp locked around his wrist, and the enforcer raised the blade. But the girl screamed no, because no one had ever done that, not for her, not for anyone, and her voice cracked the silence as the blade started to fall, and the human didn't even flinch. But something changed in the air, a sound like metal twisting a crack in the sky, and suddenly a second figure appeared from nowhere, another human in armor with weapons, and he shouted, "Hold," and fired a stun round that knocked the enforcer down, and chaos erupted as hidden drones dropped from the clouds, and a small strike team beamed into the square from cloaked orbit, their badges reading United Terran Guard, and they moved fast, taking control of the square. surrounding the guards and shielding the girl and the kneeling man, and before anyone could understand what was happening, the magistrate was restrained and the crowd pushed back. And a voice boomed from the sky, a loudspeaker from a ship now decloaking above the city, and it said, "This territory is under humanitarian enforcement. All executions are suspended, pending review," and the girl blinked because she had never seen warships that size or soldiers that clean. And then the man who had offered his arm stood and looked down at her and said, "You're safe now, little one." And she said, Why would you do that?" And he smiled with sadness in his eyes and said, "Because I remember what it's like to be small and hungry and afraid, and I promised I'd never let another child face a blade alone again." And she wanted to believe him, but she couldn't speak, only cry as the soldiers wrapped her in a thermal sheet and gave her water. And the man said, "We're not done. This place is broken, and we're going to fix it." And he looked back at the sky, where more ships were landing, and said, "It starts now." And the girl didn't know it, but everything had already changed. The square was still shaking, not from footsteps or fire, but from the silence that followed the ships once the United Terran Guard landed. Their boots didn't crush the dirt. They carried power so heavy it made the air tremble, but no one moved against them, because everyone knew the human fleet didn't come often, and when it did, things either got better or burned fast. And the girl sat now in a tent made of soft plastic walls, watching as clean people in uniforms spoke in calm voices around her, and someone touched her wrist and said, "Does it hurt?" And she didn't know what to say because her wrist wasn't chained anymore, and the pain she expected never came. Instead, a medic had wrapped it in cool bandage soaked with gel and given her a drink sweeter than anything she'd ever tasted, and her hand shook not from fever, but from confusion, because she wasn't supposed to matter, not her, not anyone from Sector 9, but they were treating her like she did, and she didn't understand why not until the man returned, the one who stepped into the blade, the one who offered his arm, and she whispered, "Why are you here?" And he knelt down with the same calm in his eyes and said, "Because we found a signal." And she said, "What signal?" And he said, "Yours. A distress beacon went out from this sector last week, coded in old Terran script." And she shook her head. "I didn't send anything." And he said, "I know, but someone did, and it reached us, and when we saw what was happening, we couldn't ignore it anymore, and now I'm here, and you're the first I saved, but not the last." And her lips trembled because no one had ever said she was first to anything before. And she asked him, "Your name?" And he said, "Jonas." And she said, "I'm Kala." And he smiled like he'd just heard a secret and said, "Hello, Kala." And for a moment, the warships, the enforcers, the pain all faded, as if they were two souls sitting in a memory that hadn't happened yet. And then, outside, someone shouted, and a blast rocked the ground, and Jonas moved faster than sight, pulling her behind the crate and yelling into a device on his wrist. But she peeked through the crack in the flap and saw the enforcers had returned. Not many, just a few stragglers. With stolen rifles and blood in their eyes, they had rallied the local thugs and those loyal to the magistrate. And now they were storming the aid camp, screaming that the humans had no right, that this was authority land. And Jonas cursed under his breath because this wasn't a rescue anymore. It was turning into a siege, and he told her, "Stay here, no matter what," and ran into the storm with nothing but a shock baton and the fury of someone who had once been small and powerless, but not anymore. And she wanted to close her eyes, but something in her refused because she had watched too long from the cracks, and this time she crawled to the flap and watched him fight. He moved like water, fast and brutal, never killing, just disabling and guarding, and pushing his people back into formation. And for a second, he looked like a legend, not a man, until one of the enforcers drew a thermal blade and lunged at his back, and Kala screamed and ran into the open without thinking. Just a girl, just skin and bones and fear, and tackled the enforcer's leg, making him stumble, and Jonas turned and knocked the blade away just in time, and everything stopped again as the dust settled and people stared, and Jonas looked at Kala with disbelief and said, "I told you to stay," and she said, "I know, but you saved me. I couldn't let you die." And he laughed, but there were tears in his voice, and he said, "Maybe you were the rescue all along." And someone behind them whispered, "Did you see what she did, a girl from 9 saved a soldier?" And another said, "Maybe they aren't rats, maybe they're just like us." And slowly the tension cracked as the crowd watched, and one by one, people began stepping forward, not to fight, but to help. They lifted crates past water-linked arms with Terran soldiers, and for the first time in decades, Sector 9 moved not under fear but hope, and Jonas looked around and saw what he'd come for, not a mission, not a war, but the spark that would change a planet, and it was her, this girl who was about to lose her arm, but found her voice. And when the sun dipped behind the towers, and the fires were out, and the silence returned, it wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting for the next part of the story, because Kala was no longer a shadow, and Jonas was no longer alone. Night fell like a shroud of quiet dread over Sector 9. But this time it did not bring silence. It brought whispers and torches, and the sound of people walking, not to hide or run, but to gather around the camp, because word had spread not just that the Terran guard had landed, but that one of their own had stood in front of a blade for a child, and that child had bled to protect him. And now every broken mother and starving miner and child too thin to speak wanted to see them with their own eyes, not out of curiosity, but because something inside them had cracked open, and they didn't know if it was hope or madness, so they came. And Kala stood in the middle of them, still in the oversized coat the medic gave her, unsure of where to put her hands, because they looked at her like she was more than a girl, like she had done something that mattered. And Jonas stood beside her, arms crossed, watching everything like a man used to ambush, but not admiration. And finally the old woman who ran the broken food tent stepped forward and asked, "Is it true you gave your arm for hers?" And Jonas said, "I offered, they didn't take it, because someone else did something braver." And the crowd looked at Kala, and she shook her head, "No. I was scared, I just ran." And the old woman smiled with teeth like worn glass and said, "Child, sometimes fear leads the strongest hearts into the fire, and now you've pulled others in with you." And one by one they began to speak, not just questions, but stories, things they hadn't dared say for years. About neighbors beaten for trading soap, about children taken because they cried too loudly, about the clean water only given to those with work badges. And Jonas listened carefully, recording names, taking photos, sending coded pulses into the sky to his command. And then he said out loud, "I came here thinking I'd stop a punishment, but I didn't realize the punishment is this place itself." And the crowd murmured, and someone shouted, "Will you stay and help us?" And he looked down at Kala and then at the camp and said, "I won't leave until it's right." And that was the spark, because the next morning the authority returned, not in stealth, but with a full convoy, armored crawlers, drones, enforcer tanks, and a voice from the sky demanding immediate withdrawal of all Terran forces. And Jonas stepped forward alone and said, "This territory is under review by the Intergalactic Accord for Humanitarian Violations, and we will not stand down." And the voice laughed and said, "You don't have the numbers to stop us." And Jonas smiled grimly and said, "Maybe not yet, but the cameras are on, and the whole galaxy is watching." And suddenly the clouds shimmered, and 100 blinking lights appeared, orbiting drone satellites, feeds broadcasting everything from every angle. And that's when the lights authority hesitated, because they knew how fragile power becomes under the eye of truth. And so they issued a threat: vacate in 24 hours or face removal by force, and Jonas returned to camp grim-faced, and Kala asked what will we do, and he said we get ready not to fight, but to stand and show them what we really are. And so they worked through the night, training villagers, building barricades, organizing food routes, and Kala found herself leading others, showing them how to hide children, where to store clean water, how to signal silently, because she had lived in the cracks, and now her knowledge was gold, and Jonas watched her with pride and sadness, because she was becoming what no one should ever have to be at her age, a leader forged in fear and fire. And when dawn came, the authority tanks rolled in slow and loud and terrifying, and the people of Sector 9 didn't run. They stood, men, women, elders, children, all in lines, holding nothing but signs and makeshift armor, and behind them, the Terran Guard stood silent, weapons ready, but raised only in defense, and the commander of the enforcers stepped out in gleaming black armor and said, "You dare stand against the law?" And Kala stepped forward before Jonas could stop her, and said, "Your law says I should have lost my arm for drinking water. Your law says my baby brother should die thirsty. Your law says my worth is the weight of my labor, but I say no." And her voice rang through the broken streets, louder than the tanks and clearer than the speakers, and the enforcer laughed and raised his baton, but Jonas fired first, not to kill but to knock the weapon away. And then everything exploded in motion, stun shots, tear gas, people shouting, but not running, and Kala found herself in the center again, dragging a boy to safety, helping an old man to shelter, until finally the enforcers retreated, not defeated, humiliated, because the whole galaxy saw them use weapons against children and old women, and that shame burned brighter than fire. And when the smoke cleared, and Jonas found Kala bruised but standing, he knelt and said, "I think you just saved a world." And she said, "I only screamed what we all wanted to say." And he said, "Sometimes one voice is all it takes to start the avalanche." And above them, the news drones blinked and beamed her face to 1,000 worlds and 1,000,000 hearts, and for the first time ever she wasn't just Kala from Sector 9, she was the girl who stood in front of tanks. The next day began with silence, not the heavy kind of fear, but the fragile hush before something sacred breaks, and Kala stood on a rooftop, watching sunlight spill over the cracked towers of Sector 9, and for the first time it didn't feel like a cage, because now the streets below were filled with people, not hiding or running, but working, fixing broken pipes, building shade walls, digging wells under the guidance of Terran engineers. And every time someone passed her they nodded, not with pity but with respect, and she didn't know what to do with that, because she was used to being invisible, a shadow, a problem to be kicked aside, not a voice people followed, not a symbol. And yet now she heard her name whispered in a dozen languages, and saw her face blinking from feeds across holoscreens carried by Terran drones, and journalists from the core worlds were starting to land, asking to speak with the girl who defied the blade. And Kala kept saying, "I didn't do anything special." But Jonas said, "You did. You changed what people expect from someone like you, and that's power, and power comes with danger." And he was right, because that night a message came from the authority, not broadcast, not official, but a private code burned into the side of the relief tent, a warning: leave or die. It was clear, and it was cruel, and it meant they were scared, not of Jonas, not of the Terran Guard, but of her, of what she represented. And Jonas paced the command tent, jaw tight, eyes darker than she'd seen before, and he said, "They'll come back, not with tanks, but with knives and silence. They'll try to erase her before the world sees too much." And Kala said, "I'm not leaving." And he said, "I know, and that's why I have to make sure you live." And then he did something she didn't expect. He gave her a chip, a small black sliver etched with strange blue lines, and he said, "If anything happens to me, plug this into the central console. It contains all the footage, all the reports, All the names, everything we've gathered, and it will send it to every free network in the galaxy." And she asked, "Why me?" And he said, "Because you're the only one I trust." And that made her chest ache in a way she didn't understand, because no one had ever trusted her with anything before. And now she held the weight of truth in her hand and didn't know if her arms were strong enough. And that night she couldn't sleep. She wandered the edge of camp listening to the distant sound of wind over sand, thinking about water and blades and voices, and how fast everything had changed. And then she saw them, shapes moving through the shadows, crawling under fences wearing stolen armor, and she ran to sound the alarm, but something hit her in the back and the world spun, and she fell hard, her vision full of dust and stars. And she heard footsteps rushing past, and then a voice above her whispering, "We warned you," and a hand grabbed her hair and lifted her face, and she saw a mask, smooth and red, and a knife rising. But then another hand grabbed the attacker and yanked him away. And Jonas was there, fists flying faster than she'd ever seen, shouting for backup, and more guards appeared. And lights flared, and the attackers ran. But not all of them made it, and in the end, 2 were caught, and 1 was dead, and Kala was bleeding from the scalp, and Jonas held her gently, whispering, "You're safe, I've got you." And for a moment, she didn't believe it, because her body felt like a broken drum. But when she opened her eyes again, she was in a real bed, not dirt, not concrete, not trash, a real bed with sheets and a fan and clean water beside her, and a medic watching her with kind eyes, and Jonas beside her holding her hand. And he said, "I told you they'd come, and I should have kept you closer." And she said, "I wanted to help." And he said, "You did. You helped more than I ever could, and that's what scares them." And then he looked away and said, "I've seen wars, Kala. I've seen planets burned and peace shattered, but I've never seen a girl stand in front of a blade and turn an entire world's head, and that's something no army can do." And she didn't know what to say, so she just held his hand tighter and whispered, "Don't leave." And he said, "Never." And outside the camp braced for another attack. But it never came, because the failed assassination changed everything. Now the galaxy wasn't just watching, it was furious, and voices rose across sectors demanding justice, calling out the authority, accusing them of targeting a child. And the pressure built until even the higher commanders of the Terran Alliance, who had remained silent, began to speak, and offers of aid came from core worlds and fringe colonies alike, and supplies flowed faster and stronger, and Sector 9 began to bloom like a broken tree finding its roots again. And Kala watched it happen, feeling like she stood at the center of a storm made of kindness and chaos, and Jonas stood beside her every step, his hand never far from hers. And the people started building a school, a real one. And they asked her to speak at its opening, and she said, "What would I say?" And Jonas said, "Tell them what you told me. Tell them you were scared and hungry, and that someone saw you, and that changed everything." And so she did. She stood in front of the people of Sector 9, with her voice shaking and her knees weak, and she told the truth, not just her story, but all of theirs. And when she finished, they didn't cheer, they cried, because it wasn't just words, it was healing. And afterwards, Jonas hugged her and said, "The authority won't stop, but neither will we." And Kala looked at the school, and the flags and the water tanks, and the smiling children, and said, "I'm not afraid anymore." And that was true, even if she didn't know what tomorrow held, because today, she had hope and people and a name that meant something. And it all started because one human stood between her and a blade. The wind carried no sand that morning, only music soft and strange, because someone had rebuilt an old speaker using salvaged wire, and now it played notes across the plaza, where once only screams and sentences echoed, and Kayla stood barefoot in the dirt, feeling the warmth of light that didn't hurt her eyes, and wondering if this was what peace tasted like, because it was new and fragile and quiet, and she didn't trust it yet, but she wanted to. And as she walked past the new school past, the tents that were slowly turning into real buildings, she saw children laughing with chalk on their hands, drawing spirals on the old concrete, and for a moment she let herself believe it was permanent. But that was before the fire, before the second message, not carved in tents this time, but sent as a broadcast, hijacking every holo signal, every speaker, every drone screen across Sector 9. A face appeared, not masked, not hidden, but proud, the authority magistrate who had once ordered her punishment. His eyes cold, his voice venom, and he said, Sector 9 belongs to the authority. The Terran Guard is violating treaty space. We will retake our land and remove the traitors. And as he spoke, footage began playing behind him, heavily edited, showing Kala receiving care from Jonas, twisted to look like she was manipulating the humans, then images of Kala with a knife in her hand when she had tackled the enforcer, twisted to make her seem dangerous, and finally a doctored clip of her giving her speech, edited to say only the parts about fear and power, and the message ended with a warning: surrender her or face destruction. And the camp went silent after that. Not out of fear, but out of fury, because the people knew what they saw wasn't true. And Kyla stood there frozen, her fingers curled into fists, as her face was turned into a weapon against the very people she loved. And Jonas stepped beside her and said, they're scared, they know what you are now. And she asked, what am I? And he said, the future, and that made her feel small and huge all at once. And soon after, the protests began, not from the people of 9, but in other sectors, distant colonies, even on core worlds, where students marched with Kala's name on their signs, saying justice for the broken ones. And the authority began losing ground in places far from her, but it only made them more dangerous here. And Jonas received word that elite forces were coming, not thugs, not locals, real kill teams, silent, precise, tasked with one goal, and that goal was Kala. And he called a meeting with his team and said, if we stay, we put her at risk. If we run, we betray everything. And Kala listened and said, I'm not running. And Jonas looked at her with pain in his eyes, because he knew what staying meant. And she said, if they want me, they'll have to try. And that night the attack came fast, silent. 2 drop pods from orbit, landing outside the walls, and the enemies slipped in through shadow using invisibility tech, bypassing sensors. But Kala had lived in darkness too long not to feel when it changed, and she woke before they reached her, and ran to the com tower, triggering the emergency flare before they could silence her. And the sky turned red with the signal, and the camp exploded with motion. Jonas and his team clashing with black armored ghosts who fought without mercy, and Kala hid and ran and fought back when she could, using everything she'd learned. And at one point she turned a corner and came face to face with one of them, mask glowing blade rising, and she froze. But then a pipe swung from behind and cracked a soldier's helmet, and an old man from the food tent shouted, get away from our girl. And the people fought back with sticks and hammers and rocks, not soldiers, not warriors, just neighbors and survivors. And together they pushed the elite back, and Jonas found Kala in the smoke, blood on his face and relief in his eyes. And he said, I told you to hide. And she said, I did, and then I didn't. And he laughed and said, that's how revolutions are born. And the next day, the footage spread faster than ever. People across the systems saw how Sector 9 defended itself, saw Kala standing among them, bruised but unbroken. And more ships came, not to fight but to protect neutral diplomats, charity fleets, off-world medics, and they said, this place is sacred now, a symbol. And Jonas looked at her and said, you're not a fugitive, you're a beacon. And that scared her more than anything, but she didn't run. She stood on that rooftop again, watching the sun rise over towers no longer broken, and she said, let them come. We're not going anywhere. And Sector 9 stood behind her, because the blade had only been the beginning. And the girl who once stole water was now a storm no wall could hold. It began with a rumble that wasn't war this time. It was deep and old, like something buried. Remembering how to breathe, and Kala woke before dawn with the sound in her bones. Not fear, but something else, something ancient. And when she ran to the edge of the platform where Sector 9 overlooked the dry canyon that once carried rivers, she saw machines crawling down the cliffs, huge spider-like drills and pump cores sent by the Terran reclamation fleets, and people gathered slowly, wrapped in blankets, holding mugs, staring in silence, because for the first time in their memory, someone was trying to bring water back. Not steal it, not bottle it, not trade it for flesh or loyalty, but give it. And Jonas stood with his arms folded, watching the engineer's work, his face unreadable. And Kala asked, is it really going to happen? And he said, the aquifer is still there, buried deep but intact, and the Terran fleet voted to divert resources to you because the whole galaxy saw your face and decided you mattered. And Kala wanted to cry because she remembered what it felt like to kneel under a blade for one jug of water. And now rivers were coming back, not for the rich, not for the law, but for the girl who once stole a drink. And Jonas said, once it flows, it changes everything: farms, food, schools, families, a future. And she asked what happens when the authority returns, and he said they will, but they'll find a different 9-1 that doesn't kneel. And the work began. Fast days blurred into weeks, machines working day and night, and the people joined in, hauling pipe, clearing tunnels, lifting beams. And Kala worked beside them, learning how the system fit, how to keep it safe, how to make it last. And at night she read reports, listened to messages sent from allies, awful people she'd never meet, who said she gave them courage. And it felt strange because she was still just a girl with scars and questions, but now she was a symbol, and symbols didn't sleep. And one morning the pumps screamed, then moaned, then howled, and the canyon trembled, and water shot from the old main line like a scream of joy. And the crowd fell silent, then erupted, people laughing, crying, holding each other, because it was real. It was what it was, life. And Kala stepped into the spray barefoot, and the children followed, and the plaza filled with dancing and music and light. And someone painted her face on the tower wall, but with wings this time. And she laughed and asked Jonas, why wings? And he said, because you lifted them. You lifted us all. And she didn't know what to say, so she threw water in his face, and he laughed harder than she'd ever heard. And for a moment, the war was gone, and it felt like everything might hold. But good things in broken places attract bad eyes. And later that week a ship appeared, not cloaked, not hidden, just silent and fast, black as smoke. It didn't broadcast a signal, didn't answer hails, and it hovered for hours above the district, until a single message came through, and it said, we're coming for the seed. And Jonas frowned, because the only thing they called a seed was the data chip. Kala carried the one with the names, the crimes, the footage, and he knew the authority had decided they couldn't win hearts, so they'd settle for erasing memory. And that night he sat with Kala under the stars and said, we may have to run someday, not to save you, but to save the truth. And she said, I'm not afraid anymore. And he said, good, because I am. And he gave her a second chip, a backup, a decoy, and taught her how to hide it. And she asked, what if they kill me? And he said, then they'll try to kill the idea of you, and they'll fail, because by then, it'll be everywhere. And she asked, will you still be with me? And he looked at her like someone looking at the last warm place in the universe, and said, always. And the next day, the black ship was gone, but the fear stayed, because they knew it was only the beginning of a deeper game. And still they worked, still they built, still they taught, because fear doesn't stop growth. And the rivers flowed, and children learned, and Kala sat at the head of the council, now not a ruler, but a root strong and buried deep. And she spoke in transmissions to other broken sectors, and told them, Your chains aren't law, they're habit, and your fear isn't weakness. It's a weapon if you hold it right, and they listened because they had seen her bleed and survive. Rise, and when the next Enforcer fleet entered orbit, it found not a slum, but a fortress not of guns but of unity and water and truth. And behind it all stood the girl they once tried to cut down. The sky over Sector 9 turned gold the day the Authority finally fell, not because they gave up, but because the truth burned longer than their lies. And when their fleet arrived in full power with cannons and broadcasts and threats louder than thunder, they expected fear, they expected surrender. They expected the girl who once trembled before a blade to kneel and beg. But what they saw instead was a wall of bodies, not soldiers, but people every age, every kind, standing shoulder to shoulder. Across the plaza, their faces marked with water, not tears, but paint shaped like drops and wings. And Kala stood in front of them wearing the same coat Jonas had given her all those months ago, now mended and patched and armored with memory, and she held no weapon, just a microphone. And when the lead cruiser broadcast surrender, the girl stepped forward and said, "You're late, the world already changed." And they didn't respond at first, just hovered like vultures, but Jonas knew what was coming. Because bullies strike when ignored, and so he stood beside Kala again, not as protector, but as partner, and said, "Whatever comes we hold," and it did come, not in ships but in pulses. They fired a signal meant to fry systems to blind drones and silence feeds, but they didn't know that Jonas had already wired everything to redundancies, and that Kyla's message had been pre-scheduled across every frequency in the Terran Accord, and when the blackout struck, the feeds didn't stop, they multiplied. And the whole galaxy watched as Sector 9 stood unarmed, unbroken, and the Authorities' attempt to erase the girl turned into their own unmasking, and the people didn't run when the troops landed. They sang not in harmony, but in strength, each voice raw and defiant, and the enforcers stepped into the square and stopped because no one moved, no one fought, and still no one feared. And one of the younger soldiers dropped his weapon, first then another, and soon the squad fractured, some kneeling, some fleeing, and the commander screamed, but it was too late because the people weren't people anymore. They were fire-shaped like a crowd, and the Authority had no water left to douse it, and the fleet left in shame, not defeated by bullets, but by belief. And later that day, diplomats arrived, officials, judges, commanders from the Terran Union and other systems, and they offered treaties, aid, reconstruction. And Kala sat through the meetings, eyes tired, heart distant, and when they asked what she wanted, she said, "I want this never to happen again, not just here, everywhere." And Jonas squeezed her hand and said, "They'll listen now," and they did, because she wasn't just a girl anymore. She was the one who made empires flinch, and years passed. And Sector 9 became a hub, a school, a station, a symbol, and Kala grew not into power but into purpose, and Jonas stayed by her side, not as shield but as home, and together they traveled not often, but when needed to speak in broken zones and dying places and say the words that lit candles in the dark. And in time she saw other girls rise, other boys stand, others who once hid find their voice, and once in a distant corner of a collapsing colony, a girl whispered, "I saw you when I was small, and I lived because you showed me how." And Kala wept that night because it meant it worked, it lasted. And when she returned to 9 and walked the square where once a blade had waited and water had cost limbs, she found it clean, full of gardens and murals and children laughing. And she sat on the bench near the old platform, and Jonas joined her, gray at the temple's hand, warm and rough. And she said, "Do you think they remember?" And he said, "Not just remember, they carry it in their bones." And she smiled and looked up at the sky, now quiet and safe, and said, "It was never about me." And he said, "No, it was about what you lit. and it never went out, and across the plaza, a little girl with a cracked jug ran laughing through the fountain, and no one stopped her because the water flowed and the fire stayed, and the human who once took her place now walked beside her, always never ahead, never behind, just close enough that when the world trembled again, they would stand together and hold the line. If you believe humanity always finds a way, subscribe for more HFY Sci-Fi stories that prove it.